This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 504 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The reason I love the NFL Draft so much, at least from a fantasy football perspective, is because we finally get to see how teams act. They can say what they want to members of the media, but when they're forced to make a selection, we gain intel. We get new information, and with new information comes better analysis. I do this show each season where instead of immediately just making my rookie rankings, I try to read between the lines. I try to look at the moves that some of these teams made during the NFL Draft, and I try to analyze those actions from front offices. And I'm not talking about specific player analysis. I'm talking about how teams approach the draft and what that says about how they might view players on their current roster. And before we get into some of that analysis, I want to remind you guys about the FanDuel Home Run Challenge. It's free to play. All you have to do is draft a team of 3 players, and you'll receive points for each home run they hit. You can then compete for a chance to win part of the $10,000 prize pool. So head over to FanDuel and play the Home Run Challenge for free. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app. Eligibility restrictions apply. I wanted to start off today's show with a general lesson that I think everyone should take away from this year's draft. And to be honest, it's something that I tried to drive home on this podcast over the last couple of months. We collectively need to stop making assumptions, especially as it pertains to the running back position. Something I talked about was how there weren't a ton of true workhorse backs in this class. But when you looked across the league pre-draft, there were a decent number of teams who could have potentially gone out and gotten one of those workhorses. Instead of assuming Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, and Travis Etienne were just going to conveniently fall to the Steelers, Falcons, or Jets, we all needed to have more of an open mind because drafts never go that cleanly, ever. And this one was no different. The Steelers did get their bell cow in Najee Harris. That was to be expected. But Travis Etienne is in Jacksonville now. Javonte Williams is in Denver. I can't give you a better example of embracing variance more than this one. Do you remember that mailbag episode from about a month or two ago where I was asked about Mike Davis? I didn't sit here and say Mike Davis is going to absolutely be the workhorse for the Atlanta Falcons this year. Instead, my approach was to recognize that we as a group were probably overstating the chance that Atlanta landed a meaningful running back in this draft. And look, the Falcons could and probably will still add something to that backfield. But if you embraced that variance, if you embraced the notion that we can't predict the future nearly as well as we think, then you're feeling good today. Because you probably got Mike Davis for cheap. And now his value has skyrocketed. Even if they add someone, you still did a good job increasing that asset's value. So I can't stress this enough. Don't overstate your ability to predict landing spot. And in addition to this, don't do that when it's very clear that a draft class is shallow at a certain position, like it was this year at running back. Now, Atlanta wasn't the only team who had a questionable backfield entering the draft who then didn't address the position. Miami's another one of those teams. They did address the position by getting Jared Dokes out of Cincinnati with their 7th round pick, but we can't make many assumptions about 7th round picks. Now, if I'm going to pat myself in the back for how I handled the Mike Davis situation this offseason, I'll do the opposite for Myles Gaskin. He was a sell candidate for me on this podcast back in January. I still stand by that process, and I actually think that he's an even better sell candidate right now. He's now the lead back on Miami post-draft. And even if you get a year of production from him, I'd rather be early in selling him than late. There's a chance that we're back in this exact same position next year where he has to survive the offseason. I don't even know if Gaskin is going to be the short yardage and goal line guy this year. That could be Malcolm Brown. And that would hurt Gaskin's ceiling. I can tell you that Gaskin is the RB20 in my projections right now, though. That's not necessarily where I'll have him ranked, but he's in a good spot to contribute. He's a big winner from the draft. But you do have to wonder if Miami would have taken Javonte Williams had Denver not traded up ahead of them. This running back class was thin. I can't stress that enough. So after those big 3 backs were off the board, teams likely didn't feel the need to reach for a running back. Now, the other team that didn't address the running back position who could have was Arizona. They signed James Conner this offseason, and Conner as competition for Chase Edmonds really isn't that bad for Edmonds. I do expect to be lower than the consensus on Edmonds post-draft, though. He's only seen 1 goal line rush in his entire NFL career, And Connor's a bruiser who can take on that role. He can take on the short yardage role. Meanwhile, the Cardinals got Rondale Moore in the draft, who may actually end up hurting Edmonds' pass catching ceiling given the style of wide receiver that he is. I don't mind Edmonds. I'm just worried that he's going to end up going really high in drafts, higher than I would want to take him. I don't want to pay up for someone who has a decent floor, but not a decent ceiling. Let's keep the running back talk going with the Jacksonville Jaguars and what it means for James Robinson. Their selection of Travis Etienne, that was a surprise. But it also wasn't a surprise. I'd been talking about Jacksonville taking a running back in this draft throughout the offseason, and they had been linked to Travis Etienne. I thought maybe that running back would be a pass catcher like Kenneth Gainwell, but they opted for a pass catcher who can also be a workhorse. And just like that, James Robinson's fantasy football value went poof. And look, I've seen the tweets. I've seen people say that they're now buying James Robinson, or that this is the time to jump in and trade for James Robinson. It's over, guys. What's the point in buying Robinson when we know that he's absolutely going to have a cap ceiling as long as Travis Etienne is healthy? Travis Etienne is arguably the best receiving back in this class. He's explosive, and he's now a first-round pick. First-round running backs have averaged over 200 rush attempts as rookies over the last decade. Now, I will say there's a chance that Urban Meyer just isn't very sharp. He actually said that Robinson and Hyde are his 1-2 punch, and that Travis Etienne is their third down back. That's what he talked about post-draft. I'm not even kidding. If that comes to fruition and the Jags use Etienne in that way, then Jacksonville's got a lot to worry about with their new head coach. And some might look at that quote and view it as a plus for James Robinson. But an issue I have is that Meyer is still lumping Robinson in with Carlos Hyde. It's not like he's saying James Robinson is the early down guy and Travis Etienne is the third down back. It all just screams coach speak. This is just a really good example of not overestimating your ability to predict how teams are going to be managed when there's a new regime that gets put in place. This was my biggest fear with James Robinson this offseason. As much as I liked him last year, and as much as I like him in general, it's almost always better to sell an undrafted free agent than buy them, especially when there's a new coaching staff in town. A lot of mock drafts had the Giants going with Devontae Smith in the first round. But the Eagles got him before they were up to pick, so they traded back and they allowed the Bears to then get Justin Fields. But when the Giants traded back, they still got a wide receiver. But instead of Smith, it was Kadarius Toney, who you guys know doesn't look very good in my prospect model. Regardless of how I might feel about Toney himself, the apparent push for Devontae Smith that then turned into another wide receiver shows us that they're not totally content with their current wide receiver room. Maybe it's because Sterling Shepard could easily be gone next season. Or maybe they just don't like Darius Slayton much. The difference, though, between Smith and Toney is pretty substantial in my eyes. Toney could use the first year to develop and be more of a gadget-type player as a rookie. That would allow the existing receivers to not get dinged all that much. If it had been Devontae Smith, I'd be way more concerned. Even still, the Giants clearly want to set Daniel Jones up for success. And they also clearly didn't feel 100% great about their wide receiver group heading into that draft. That's not good news for non-Kenny Golladay receivers on that team. The Steelers had pretty big offensive line issues heading into the draft. I've let it be known that a huge reason the Steelers did what they did offensively last year, which was not be able to run the ball and throw these quick, short passes, was completely driven by the offensive line. They had to get the ball out quickly because they didn't have good protection. And as you guys know, I'm pretty anti-first-round running back. I can understand what the Steelers were thinking with that Najee Harris pick. This running back class lacked depth. If they didn't get a running back with that pick, they weren't going to get a workhorse back, or at least a projected workhorse back. I just think the Steelers have enough holes up front where they should have addressed running back in free agency to have more flexibility during the draft, or just trade down. Regardless, they went after Najee Harris. They have Najee Harris. And it seems like Pittsburgh believes that they have better personnel on that offensive line and on offense in general than others do. This quote from Mike Tomlin sort of says that. Tomlin said, quote, "The improvements in the running game go beyond just the acquisition of additional players. We're capable of performing better than we have, players aside. Schematics, formations, the things that we do to give ourselves a strategic advantage need to be improved. And that's some of the things that we're working on." To be fair, it's hard for Pittsburgh's offensive line to be worse than it was last year. And we probably tend to be arrogant with our ability to predict offensive line play. The Steelers will likely try to be more balanced than they were last year. But keep in mind, this is a team that's ranked in the top 10 in neutral script pass-to-rush ratio in each of Ben Roethlisberger's last 5 seasons. The only time they weren't over the last 6 years was when Ben Roethlisberger was injured. So I do still expect them to be fairly pass-heavy, at least compared to the average team. And that's fine for Najee Harris. He's a great receiver. He should be a beast in fantasy football right away. Right now, my projections have him as a mid to high-end RB2. If you want to hear why I'm not a big fan of Baltimore as a landing spot for wide receivers, give last week's mailbag a listen. Clearly, when Baltimore took my wide receiver 2, Rashad Bateman, at the end of the first round, I was tilted. I love the pick from a real football standpoint. I hated it from a fantasy one. I'll have my rankings show next week, but Bateman went from the top of that tier, and he was bumped down a little bit because of this landing spot. He's not done for, he just took a hit. But Baltimore also spent a 4th rounder on Tylan Wallace, who went later than expected in this draft. It doesn't take much reading between the lines to see that Baltimore's not satisfied with their current wide receivers, maybe Marquise Brown aside. These moves do hurt Marquise Brown, though. As I said last week, he was good down the stretch last year, but that was also while averaging a touchdown per game and a 35% target share per game. He's not going to come close to that with one of the best wideouts in this class in Rashad Bateman, and then Tylan Wallace being a solid prospect as well. That's new and good competition for Hollywood Brown. I'd imagine the Ravens do become a little bit more pass-heavy than they've been. To what degree is the question? That's what I talked about on last week's mailbag show. I think people will project that bump in passing to be higher than I will. Rashad Bateman and Tylan Wallace don't necessarily mean the Ravens completely change their offense. There's no reason for them to completely change it. They've been one of the best offenses in the league since Lamar Jackson took over. And Jackson is at his best when he's running the football. That's why this is not the same situation as what we had with Buffalo last year. And we also can't assume that Rashad Bateman is as good as Stefon Diggs. The moves, though, made total sense from a real football perspective. From a fantasy one, it's definitely a boost for Lamar Jackson in the offense in general, but it's still not the most ideal landing spot for those receivers. Now, I mentioned Javonte Williams a little bit earlier on the show, and his landing spot was with Denver. At first, it does not look great, but Denver doesn't make that move with the intent of not using Javonte Williams. That's not how this works. Maybe Melvin Gordon does stick around and Williams is in this timeshare here in year 1, but Denver knew what they were doing. They wanted Javonte Williams. They jumped a running back needy team in the draft, which was Miami, and they traded up to get Javonte. And for what it's worth, I have found that trade-up running backs, they fare better during their rookie seasons than non-trade-up ones. If you look back since 2011, trade-up running backs in round 1, and there's not a big sample for round 1 guys, but they averaged about 223 attempts during their first season. Every other round 1 running back had an average attempts of 199. Now, non-trade-up running backs in round 1 did better than trade-up ones from a points per game standpoint. But that's skewed because of players like Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott. Most trade-up situations in the first round are for the middle and the late first round. They're not trading up often for top 5 picks to get a running back. Where I'm more interested in, though, is round 2 and 3. I looked at top 100 picks when analyzing this. So if we're looking at round 2 and 3 players, that's after pick 32 up through pick 100. Of the running backs who were traded up for, they averaged about 126 attempts as rookies. That fell by about 22 rush attempts for players who weren't traded up for. And in terms of PPR points per game, the trade-up running backs averaged 9.2 points per game. The non-trade-up running backs were at 7.5. So there could be something there. And I think it intuitively does make some sense. Running backs need coaches to throw them on the field to produce. If a team is trading up to get that player, there's likely some sort of need. So those running backs then will have a higher shot to see the field. Overall, this wasn't a bad spot for Javonte Williams, in my opinion. And I think that he could end up being an underrated value in redraft formats this year. This was a decent wide receiver class, but like the running back one, I viewed it as top heavy. It's just that the top of the wide receiver class was a little bit deeper than the running back one. Maybe that's why we saw what we saw last week with the draft. There are plenty of wide receiver needy teams out there, and a handful of them barely address the position. The Lions entered the draft with one of the worst wide receiver depth charts that I've ever seen. And they didn't address the position until they took Amon-Ra St. Brown at pick 112. I think it was a great value pick, Don't get me wrong, but the Lions are in rebuild mode and just picked off players that they like best before addressing true needs. That's at least what it seemed like, and you can't necessarily fault them for that. St. Brown walks into a situation, though, where he could see volume right away. And I hope that he's able to play the slot there because he's more natural in the slot. He could be Jared Goff's new Cooper Kupp. But like across the league, New England only got a 7th round wide receiver. Indianapolis only took one wide receiver, which was my guy, Mike Strawn. Kansas City, after losing Sammy Watkins, took Cornell Powell in the 5th. That all speaks to the existing players on those rosters. Tennessee was the one team that surprised me most, though, with their lack of wide receiver love in this draft. Their number 2 receiver entering the draft was Josh Reynolds. And despite having 3 day 2 picks, Tennessee waited until day 3 to get Dez Fitzpatrick from Louisville, a player who really looks average in my model. And then they took Racey McMath in the 6th round, another player who didn't have great production, but he does have good athleticism. Maybe one of those guys hits. It's just that there were some solid wide receivers to choose from in the 2nd and 3rd round, and Tennessee opted against getting those wide receivers. If you're looking for bench depth, Josh Reynolds is a low-key winner of this draft. And then obviously A.J. Brown could just have an insane year. The last situation and player that I want to touch on today is the 49ers trading up and getting Trey Sermon. Sermon was my RB4 pre-draft, partially because I figured that he'd be the 4th running back off the board, given his size and potential ability to handle a big workload. But San Francisco traded up to get him, and like I said, that's a good sign for fantasy purposes. They also took Elijah Mitchell, and considering Kyle Shanahan's history of getting something out of most running backs in his system, Mitchell's at least someone to watch out for. But I wouldn't be scared of Mitchell for Sermon, considering the capital spent and the type of players they are. Mitchell's a little bit leaner with speed. He could be a good change of pace back for the 49ers. Sermon could be a bell cow. I actually think this is one of those ambiguous backfields that you can aggressively target in redraft leagues. Trey Sermon was a big winner this past week. Now, I know there are a lot of situations that I didn't fully cover on today's show. I just wanted to walk through the process that I think about once the draft is over. Hopefully it helped you think about the draft results a little bit differently and in a more meaningful way. I'll dig more into these prospects and their impacts on next week's show. That's the post-draft ranking show. But if you have any questions about the draft, you can always hit me up for this week's mailbag episode. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.